All right, guys, the time has finally come to do the first ever cupping of a Lifestyle Lab coffee feature. We have brought Mark back from Mirror Coffee Roasters to join us because, of course, he is going to be able to offer far more insight than myself into these two coffees. We've had some great participation so far, but I also want to say that these two coffees are going to continue to be available on the Mirror Coffee Roasters website. They'll be linked down in the description below. So if you were waiting for the cupping to see if these were coffees that you sounded interested in, then they're still available. So Mark, thanks for joining us again. I'm really excited to do this.
Matt, thanks for having me. I'm just as excited to do this as well. We have some fun and interesting coffees on the table that I'm looking forward to cupping with everyone.
I think you made two awesome selections. I did do a bit of a preliminary cupping last night, but before I jump into those thoughts, let's do a quick overview for those who have maybe not cupped before on how to cup, what they're gonna need, and then we'll just jump straight in.
Cupping is a very great way to simplify the brewing process in general. So even if you have a small little bowl, it's not super big, but just any bowl will really do. As long as you can put grounds in there, pour coffee in there, you should be good. And you'll probably need 1 or 2 spoons, preferably. You might need some kind of scale to measure out your grounds, your coffee. And the last thing would probably be you need a kettle to boil your water. Outside of that, well, of course you need to grind your coffee somehow, so that'll be nice. But I think that's it.
Okay, so we've got bowls, we've got coffee, we've got spoons. Another thing that I have done here, you can see 4 cups in front of me, even though we only have 2 coffees. The reason sometimes people do that is just in case you happen to get a bean defect in one of these cups, you have a backup. So in case there's something wrong with one, you can recognize that and just taste from the second one. Not saying there's gonna be anything wrong with these coffees, but that's generally kind of good practice. So the first step in any cupping is to just assess the dry aroma of these coffees. So hopefully by now you've got your coffees laid out in front, and we're gonna go ahead and do that. I find that it helps to give it a little bit of a tap. You can see Mark doing it as well. What this does is it allows some of the gases to come out and makes smelling a whole lot easier. You'd be surprised at how effective this is.
Don't be afraid to stick your nose in there. Watch out, don't breathe in as your nose is right next to the grounds. That might not be the most pleasing experience.
So right off the bat, you can tell that these two coffees are really different. So what are kind of the things that people are gonna be smelling right off the bat here, Mark?
Yeah, so smelling this Guatemalan coffee, I'm getting, once again, kind of like what we talked about in the other video, it's a very kind of simple and approachable coffee, but really solid. I'm getting some nice sweetness coming off of it, kind of a little chocolatey with maybe a slight, kind of like a stone fruit sweetness, and perhaps a little citrusiness, but most of it is like a really big chocolate bar, really, is what I'm getting. What about you, Matt?
I'm getting a little bit, of that bitter chocolate note, not like a heavy kind of super sweet chocolate, but a little bit of bitterness. And again, yeah, that stone fruit, maybe a little bit of kind of vegetal, a little bit of herbiness, but yeah, mostly just a basic like we looked for, some chocolate, some citrus, keeping it simple. And then jumping over to the Marta, something's sticking out there. And in my first cupping yesterday, I could not pinpointing it, but there is a very pronounced flavor there. So if you guys know in the comments at any point in this cupping, let me know. Mark, just tell me what it is. You roasted this coffee.
Tell you what it is. Well, here's the thing that we should preface this cupping with these aromas and the taste, is that everybody has a different kind of flavor profile, palate, background. Everybody's at different stages of their, honing in their smells, their aromas, and their tasting palate. And as we get into, brewing, everybody's brewing with different kinds of water, and that's something that is going to be really hard to control across everybody. So what maybe I myself am tasting or smelling and what Matt is smelling or tasting might be a little different from you, and that's not a bad thing. That just means, well, these coffees are complex and you might be getting something a little different, and that's okay. So that being said, what I'm getting off of this of the Marta Ruby, the Colombian. Oh man, wow. Wow, I'm getting almost like a jumble of a lot of things. I'm getting like some nice berries in there, a little bit of grape that's adding to that kind of like the brightness in the smell. But really the thickness and the body of it is a really solid like white chocolate. And white chocolate, what we've noticed here at Mir, can also kind of smell a little bit vanilla-y, which kind of makes sense with white chocolate. So kind of like a chocolate, but it's sweet. It's got like a candied smell to it. But white chocolate would probably be the best way I'd explain it. What about you? What are you getting?
I think that the word candied is something that I hadn't considered before, and vanilla. And that's starting to get me a bit closer to that mysterious flavor that I have been searching for. But yes, like Mark said, these are very broad flavors. We're not smelling, grape. We're not smelling milk chocolate, although sometimes chocolate can be quite pronounced. But these are general flavors, some acidity, some fruitiness. And it's just fun to try and guess as accurately as possible. So smell these for as long as you guys like. Continue going back and forth. And when you are ready, we're going to add some water and move on to the next stage of the cupping. So to do that, we now have our 10 grams of coffee. And to that, we are going to add 150 grams of water at 200 Fahrenheit or around 93 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, something to consider with pouring water into these bowls. Even if you don't have, the exact ratio, to the gram, even if you might not even have a scale at all, the cupping process was really supposed to be, a process that was kind of foolproof or error-proof. Something, Matt, I think we didn't touch upon is grind setting. There isn't no specific exact, grind setting or grind size, and it would be a little different since we all probably have different grind settings and grinders. Something that I kind of aim for is around the pour over size, maybe a little slightly finer than what you'd normally grind as a pour over. That's what works with me, and that's something that I've calibrated my palate to enjoy. So that's where I'm at. Matt, do you have anything to add about grind setting?
Yep. For me, my grind point is actually generally a little bit coarser than pour over. So that's very interesting to hear from you, Mark. But that really drives home the point that cuppings are pretty foolproof. It's just a very simple way of tasting coffee. I think a lot of people on this channel probably found this channel through getting frustrated trying to dial in espresso, just getting frustrated with coffee in general. And this will be very refreshing if you're one of those people.
This is also a great way to kind of test your brewing skills. If you're cupping a coffee and it's tasting one way and all your brews are falling short of a cupping, that's a great way for you to kind of check up on like what's going on in my brewing that I'm not able to achieve in the cupping. And this is more specifically also for filter coffee, so you may not be able to get that on espresso since it's so different, but it's a great way to kind of QC your brewing skills.
You guys might have noticed that I put down a 5th cup on this table, and that is because at this point, or even at the start with the grounds, I find it really useful to have a baseline. So cupping really works best, or any kind of tasting works best, if you're comparing between a variety of things. It makes it easier to compare and contrast. So if you have both these coffees, that's awesome. But if you only have one, or even if you do have both, I encourage you to also add in something that you are familiar with. And with that being said, I think we're kind of coming up on 4.5, 5 minutes-ish, and we're at the next stage of the cupping. Why don't you explain what we're going to do next, Mark?
Yeah, so what's starting to form in your bowls is a crust. It's a thick layer of just ground sitting at the top. Now, you won't want to be drinking this. It would not be a pleasing experience. So what we're going to do is I'll actually make the most of this crust and try to enjoy the aromas coming off the cup. So right now you can be doing your wet smells, kind of smelling when the grounds are wet, but especially at around the 4.5 minute, 5 minute mark, you can go ahead and do a couple breaks of the crust with your spoon. And this way, when the crust breaks, you should be getting kind of like a whiff of aromas hitting your nose. giving you an extra, experience at smelling some of the nuances in these bowls.
I want to encourage everyone to get right in there as they're doing this step. You'll often hear people or see people with their nose right up to the cup as they're clearing the crust. So it's a moment when a lot of aroma is released. So really get in there.
That was delightful. I really enjoyed that.
Now, if you're using just one spoon, I do recommend cleaning it off in between, just to make sure you're not cross-contaminating your different cups. That Marta is incredible.
Really, yeah. It's the contrast between the two coffees and aromas is just absolutely delightful. Gives you a nice little sneak peek into how different coffees can be. In their aromas and flavors. So it's gonna be exciting. And just as Matt said, go ahead and dip your spoon into the hot water or into the water bowl after every time your spoon comes into contact with water. And this is to avoid the contamination between the cups.
So still on the nose here, I'm getting a little bit more herbiness on the Guatemalan than fruitiness, but which is interesting because when I remember from my other tasting, that kind of changes on the palate. So let me know what you guys are smelling, whether it's a bit more fruity, a little bit more herbal.
As you're done breaking the crust, you can go ahead and scrape off the grounds at the top. If you've never done this before, this might be a little challenging, which don't be so hard on yourself. Practice makes perfect. I'm scraping that crust off of the bowl. You can go ahead and put those kind of that crust, the grounds, you can dump them into a separate bowl, which can kind of be your temporary trash can for those grounds. Right now, as we're approaching about 9 minutes, 10 minutes, what we're trying to do is just let these coffees cool to, a manageable drinking temperature, so you don't want to burn yourself. And that usually happens around the 10, 11 minute mark. That temperature will come down to be able to be enjoyable drinking it.
And if you guys see me kind of glancing off to the side at all, it's because yesterday when I did my kind of preliminary cupping, I made some notes. And this can be kind of a fun thing to do if you try lots of coffees, if you enjoy that, write it down. Don't try to go off of memory. Make a little logbook, make a little diary. It's a fun thing to keep as you go along your coffee journey. And if you want to ever refer back to it, it's really good for just kind of building your knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. I recently just started actually writing down my recipes for coffees. My coffees are like rotating almost on a daily basis. And when you're drinking like a couple different coffees all at once, it's kind of hard to get every brew dialed in because you just keep forgetting your grind setting, keep forgetting what you're getting. And so I'm like, I'm going to put an end to this and I'm going to start writing down my recipes, my grind settings, what I'm getting off of each cupping. I think it's a great activity to do as you're brewing coffee or cupping. I think I'm kind of getting in my wet smells exactly what I'm getting on my dry smells. In the Guatemalan, I'm still getting that kind of that chocolatey citrusiness going on. And then in the Colombia, I'm still getting that rich white chocolate sweetness in my nose with like some berry grape-esque stuff going on somewhere in there. But yeah, they're smelling pretty tasty to me. So impatiently waiting for them to cool down.
So why then, this is a good time to talk about why these two coffees taste so different. One is from Guatemala, one is from Colombia, but there might actually be a bigger reason these are tasting different. Why is that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, the really big thing that we can't ignore is that it's from completely different origins and countries and farms. And that matters a lot because even two farms may be, on one side of the hill than on the other side of the hill can have significantly different flavor profiles. So we need to acknowledge that they're, two different Central American coffees. However, one of the biggest things going on here is the processing method. So the Guatemalan is a wash process, and the Colombia Martarubi is an anaerobic natural process. So the wash process, just to give you the processing in a nutshell, then once the cherries are picked off of the tree, they go through a depulper, which pretty much takes the seed out of the cherry. And as soon as the seed comes out of the cherry, they go ahead and wash the coffee off. All that mucilage, the stickiness that's left on there, it gets washed off, and then they sit on drying beds and they dry until they reach optimal moisture content percentage. As for the anaerobic natural, anaerobic really means without air, fermenting without air. So the way they do it is they kind of seal these coffees into a bin of some sort, and the coffees will sit there in cherries as full cherries for X amount of time. Then they're processed naturally, which means the cherries sit outside and just simply dry the seed dries inside of the cherry. And that's where a lot of naturals get a little bit of their kind of that booziness, that fermentiness, which comes from that processing. So this is, an anaerobic process, meaning they're sitting in some kind of container or in a bag, closed off from air, and they're fermenting, and then they're left outside to dry in the cherry, and then the cherry gets taken off and the seed is left.
I think that at least it wasn't intentional on my side, but maybe it was subtly intentional on what I asked Mark to do. If you recall, when we announced these coffees, I said, pick something a little bit more right up the line, a bit more standard, to compare with something a bit funkier. And thinking back on that kind of implies, let's do a clean, washed process coffee, which generally gives you a bit more cleaner, more pronounced, just kind of, clean flavors. And then the natural, which, like Mark described, adds a bit of that fermentiness, a bit of that funkiness. Now, I must say this Martarubi isn't anywhere near the funkiest coffee I have ever tried. Right. You can get way crazier, but this is a great introduction to how processing method really impacts coffees.
Really, yeah. And when we're buying this coffee, this green coffee, we kind of wanted some of that experimental processing, the funkiness that comes with the anaerobic natural coffees. But we also didn't want to overdo it, because just like anything that ferments a little too long, you start to include, some undesirable flavors. So what we really enjoyed about this coffee is that it adds some of the funkiness that, some people enjoy, but it's also not completely overdone. So you're kind of trying to get the best of both worlds. But we really enjoy this coffee as an anaerobic natural.
I think it's been an awesome choice. All right, we should be about good to start tasting, I think. Let's dive in, and then we'll chat a bit about what we're tasting.
Let's do it.
So the slurp. We need to talk briefly about the slurp. People put a lot of emphasis on this, but it's a pretty basic principle. Some people have very exact techniques. They use their teeth, they use their tongue. It's about spraying the back of your palate, kind of aerating the coffee, and it really genuinely does make it easier to taste. If you don't want to, you don't have to, but there is some science behind it. I am not one for describing an exact technique. Everyone knows how to slurp. Mark, do you have a specific technique?
I do not have a specific technique. Just a classic slurp is good. Just watch out. If you end up choking on something you slurped a little too far, that's totally natural. It happens to the best of us. So don't worry, but definitely be careful. You're not dying out there cupping coffees.
Don't over slurp. Exactly. So remember to switch bowls. If you have done 4 bowls like me, switch between them, see if there's a difference. And once again, you should be tasting a quite pronounced difference between these 2 coffees, and even your third coffee if you have included that kind of baseline that I was describing.
Oh, wow.
So this
Wow.
isn't just me and Mark tasting. We are tasting all along with you guys. I definitely want to play around with the idea of doing live cuppings for this first one to work out the bugs, work out the kinks. I think it was a good idea to pre-record it. But let us know what you guys are tasting down in the description. It's so much more fun when everyone contributes, and I'm still looking for that mystery tasting note on the Marta.
Definitely, please drop it down in the comments what you're tasting about each coffees, whether that's the dry aromas, the wet aromas, what you're getting in the taste. As we cup, the coffees are actively cooling, which just makes cupping a lot more interesting. Oftentimes people will just, take a couple sips and they're done. I really enjoy cupping until they cools down quite significantly. The coffee starts to open up a lot, giving you so much more interest and intrigue as it cools with different flavors coming through. And I'm actually going to be watching this back probably later. So I would love to read the comments and see what you guys are thinking with both of these coffees. This is fun.
So the reason that we waited so long to taste these, I don't think we necessarily went into that in too much detail, but as coffee cools, it gets so much easier to taste. This was a big point of contention for me when I was reviewing the Ember mugs. I love the Ember mug. My girlfriend loves the Ember mug. Keeps your coffee warm, but it's also interesting to let the coffee cool because you can really start to taste it way, way better as it cools down. So that's the stage that we're at now. That's why we waited 10, 12 minutes.
I would totally agree with that about the Ember mug. To be honest, every time I order either a batch brew or a pour over, it's usually just sitting off to the side for about 5 to 10 minutes while I let it cool. Coffees, when they're enjoyed too hot, I think lack some of that experience, even though it's also kind of nice to be able to taste it when it's really hot and when it's cooled down. And what you'll notice really is a wide range of flavor coming out at different stages of the temperature.
All right, so now that we're tasting these, let's quickly run through if anything has changed as we're tasting, or if it's just the same as it was on the nose. What are you getting here? Final thoughts on these tasting notes, Mark?
Oh boy. I'm enjoying this a lot, actually. I know I've cupped these coffees 100 times probably, but this is just such an enjoyable experience because they're so vastly different from each other, yet they kind of have some overlapping similarities between one another as well, which makes it fun. I don't know, Matt, maybe you can give me your opinion first. So I don't sway you with my bias.
Very true. That's probably a good idea. So my notes that I have and what I'm tasting again here is that with the Guatemalan on the nose, I was getting that herbiness. And then as soon as I went in to taste it, and then when I pulled it later in the evening on espresso, it came through as citrus. So I think your experience came through there, and the tasting notes on the bag are right on. It's just that little bit of bitter chocolate and some citrus, maybe some orange peel coming through there. And then, the Marta's driving me crazy, but I think that the grape note, I actually think I might show this in my notes. At the actual tasting phase of my initial cupping, I could put, okay, fine, grape. I relented, I said, fine, it's grape. So that's what I've written there, but I also just really enjoy how the Marta has that sweetness underneath. It's not all fruitiness, fruity berries. It's got that sweetness that you've described as vanilla or white chocolate. That's what I really enjoy about that coffee.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the Guatemala is very just simple. It's to the point, just get me there. It's chocolate, citrus, and it's, I would love to hear later on maybe your experience pulling it on espresso, but it's going to be a solid coffee for that because of that is just straight and to the point, but still nuanced enough and sweet enough to be able to give you some intrigue there. The Marta Ruby is, wow, am I enjoying this? I don't know why, but off of this cupping, I'm getting some kind of fun Jolly Rancher sweetness. The berries are definitely coming through that are the notes on the coffee bag. The grape, for sure. I would totally agree. There's that nice grape acidity in there. And the white chocolate is kind of like the pillow in the flavor profile that's kind of holding everything up. It's sweet. It gives the coffee a nice thickness and body to it that is just so enjoyable. And it has a unique sweetness to it as well, which is that white chocolate kind of vanilla flavor that I don't know, I'm just really enjoying this.
Mark is enamored by the Marta Ruby. I've been thoroughly enjoying it as well. However, as you kind of alluded to, I think it's important to talk about how we have been brewing these. I did brew these last night. I pulled the Guatemalan on espresso, and there the citrus notes really came through. But as I then watered it down to an Americano, as I normally do, it just became very, very balanced. I think that the Guatemalan is a coffee that you could give to someone who's just, you're trying to, showcase the world of specialty coffee to, and say, try this, and they would go, wow, that's a really good coffee. It's just very balanced. And then if you take the Marta and gave that to them after, they'd go, what on earth is that?
Yeah.
So it's two great kind of intro coffees, and they're very, very different. The Marta Ruby I pulled on the decent with Scott Rayo's Filter 2.1 profile. It was very good. It was very strong, maybe a little too funky for me, honestly. That profile is an absolute magnifying glass, as I've alluded to before. But for a pour over or for a drip, I think it's fantastic, really, really interesting coffee. So in terms of recipes, I was very happy with a quite traditional kind of 1 to 2 on the Guatemalan. I was finding, actually for both of these coffees, I was having to grind a little bit finer than I normally would for the espresso on the Guatemalan, and then as a pour over on the Marta Ruby. I don't know if you've experienced the same, and that's actually something I heard from a few people on Instagram who reached out. They said, I'm loving the Marta Ruby. I actually had to dial the grind a little bit finer though, because it was drawing down a little too quick. Do you have a good pour over recipe for the Marta that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. You and your audience saying about you have to grind a little finer for this coffee, for sure. And I think it could be partly to origin, but it could be also partly to the processing method. And so yeah, I'm grinding the Marta Ruby. I'm probably grinding finer than nearly all of my coffees. As for a recipe we like to brew on a V60, and we have a very simple recipe. It's a 20 grams dose to about 300 grams or milliliters of water out. So we're aiming for kind of like a 1 to 15, which the thought behind that is I kind of like a thicker body to my filter coffee. I just really enjoy it. And especially for a nuanced cup like that, I really want those flavors to be thick in the mouthfeel. As for the Guatemalan, today I brewed it on a 1 to 16, if I remember correctly. And it was nice because it was a little more watered down, but it had that chocolate and that citrus, the simple flavor profile, came through still very strongly, And so we're doing 20 grams in, 300 grams out of water. And I believe my target time is about 3 minutes and 15 seconds. So not super long. And I'm doing about a 45-second bloom. Now that recipe will be different according to your flow rate of how you're pouring. So that'll change a lot. And also consider, we can't ignore the fact that we all have different water. So take it with a grain of salt, use it as kind of a general target, but adjust accordingly to your flavor profile needs, whether you want something stronger or a little more lighter in the mouth. But yeah, that's how I'm brewing it. And as for espresso, I like to push my espresso a little more to 1 to 2.5. And I noticed that the Marta Ruby was very enjoyable at around 1 to 2.5 to 1 to 2.8. So kind of a little pushing the traditional espresso ratio.
I can definitely see why the Marta would call for that. I haven't pulled this on a traditional espresso shot yet, so you're gonna have to take Mark's word for that. In terms of the water temperature for those pour over recipes, do you have to go a little bit hotter?
Yeah, for both of these coffees, I'm just going right off of boil, and I'm at almost nearly sea level, so my water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. That may be a little different for you, but right off of boil works really well for me.
Okay, there you go. Well, I think that this was a great first cupping. I think that we had a great participation. And what I want to do now is hear the feedback of you guys, the audience, and all you guys who participated down in the comments. Or if you just loved it, say do more of the same. Mark and I can talk about coffee for a very, very long time. We even created a new game show as we were setting up for this. I was grinding my coffee in the back, and through the AirPod, Mark goes, "Is that a fellow ode?" And I go, "Yes, it is, sir." So if you want to participate in the first ever blind What's That Grinder competition, that will also be coming up on the Lifestyle Lab channel, or maybe the Mirror Coffee Roasters podcast. I don't know. We're going to plug that again. If you guys have enjoyed what you've seen from Mark, definitely check that one out. But I think that's kind of it. Let us know what you guys are tasting, what you're feeling. Again, both of these coffees will continue to be available for purchase as long as that link is down there. There will always be some delicious coffee linked down in that description. And thanks for watching. Mark, thank you so much for doing this. This was really, really enjoyable. And thank you for being the inaugural roastery feature on the Lifestyle Lab channel.
Matt, it was an honor and a pleasure, and I really enjoyed cupping these coffees with you.